Africa did not choose its name. No African language created it. The word came from outsiders, was standardized by foreigners, and later accepted globally. So the real question is not what Africa means, but who decided it. What you're about to discover will completely change how you think about one of the world's most recognizable continent names. Because the story behind who named Africa reveals a fascinating web of ancient civilizations, colonial powers, and historical accidents that shaped how we see an entire continent today. I'm going to take you on a journey through time to uncover the real people behind this name. And trust me, it's not what you expect. We'll explore ancient Roman scholars, medieval European mapmakers, and even dive into some conspiracy theories that might actually hold water. By the end of this video, you'll never look at the name Africa the same way again. Let's start with what most people think they know. Ask anyone on the street who named Africa, and they'll probably shrug or guess it was some ancient African civilization. But here's where it gets interesting. The name Africa wasn't created by Africans at all. It was imposed from the outside, and the story of how that happened reveals everything about power, perspective, and how history gets written. The earliest known use of the term Africa comes from ancient Rome, around the 3rd century BCE. But even then, it wasn't referring to the entire continent. The Romans used Africa to describe a small region in what we now call Tunisia and parts of Libya. This was after they conquered Carthage and needed a name for their new province. They called it Africa Proconsularis. But here's where things get really fascinating. The Romans didn't just make up this word out of thin air. They borrowed it from somewhere, and this is where our detective story begins. Some historians believe the Romans adapted the name from the Afri people, a Berber tribe that lived in the region around Carthage. The Afri were likely descendants of ancient North African populations who had been there for thousands of years. Think about that for a moment. A small tribal name from North Africa eventually became the label for an entire continent containing over 50 countries and more than 1 billion people. It's like naming all of Asia after a single village in Mongolia. The scale of this linguistic expansion is absolutely mind-blowing. But wait, there's another theory that's equally compelling. Some scholars argue the name comes from the Latin word aprica, meaning sunny, or from the Greek word Afrik, meaning without cold. This would make sense because to the Romans and Greeks, North Africa represented the warm, sun-baked lands to the south. They were essentially naming an entire continent based on the weather they experienced in one small corner of it. Here's where our story takes a crucial turn. For over 1,000 years after Rome fell, the name Africa remained relatively localized to North Africa. Medieval European maps often showed different names for different parts of what we now call Africa. They might label the north as Africa, but the rest of the continent appeared as Ethiopia. Ethiopia, or simply unknown lands filled with fantastical creatures and warnings about dragons. The real expansion of the name Africa to cover the entire continent happened during the Renaissance, and this is where European cartographers become the true villains of our story. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as European exploration increased, mapmakers needed a way to label the massive landmass they were discovering. Instead of asking the people who lived there what they called their lands, these cartographers simply extended the Roman name Africa southward until it covered everything. Gerardus Mercator, the famous Flemish cartographer whose map projection we still use today, played a huge role in standardizing Africa as the continental name. His influential maps from the 1560s clearly labeled the entire landmass as Africa. And since European maps became the global standard, this naming stuck everywhere. But here's what's truly staggering about this process. The people living across this vast continent had their own names for their regions. The Swahili coast had its own identity. The kingdoms of West Africa had their own names. The highlands of Ethiopia maintained their distinct identity. The southern regions had their own tribal and regional names. None of them called themselves African. Yet European cartographers sitting in their studies in Amsterdam, Brussels, and London decided that all these diverse peoples and regions should share a name derived from a small Roman province in North Africa. It's geographical colonialism at its most basic level, the power to name and define entire populations from the outside. The impact of this naming decision cannot be overstated. When European colonialism really ramped up in the 19th century, the name Africa had already been established on maps for centuries. This made it easier for colonial powers to think of the continent as a single entity to be carved up and conquered, rather than recognizing the incredible diversity of nations, kingdoms, and peoples that actually existed there. Think about how different history might have been if Europeans had adopted regional names instead. What if they had recognized Kemet, the ancient Egyptian name for their land? What if they had used Alkebulan, which some sources claim was an ancient name, meaning mother of mankind? What if they had simply asked people what they called their own territories? But there's another layer to this story that's even more intriguing. Some modern historians and activists argue that the name Africa itself carries negative connotations that were deliberately chosen. They point out that in Latin, Africa can be broken down to mean without cold. But it can also be interpreted as without spirit or without life. Whether this interpretation is linguistically accurate is debated, but it raises important questions about the power of naming. The psychological impact of having your entire continent named by outsiders runs deep. It's part of a broader pattern where European perspectives became the default way of understanding the world. Africa was dark, mysterious, primitive. These weren't descriptions created by Africans about themselves. These were external labels that became internalized over centuries. Today, there are movements across the continent to reclaim naming power. Some scholars and activists promote using Alkebulan instead of Africa. Others focus on emphasizing individual country names and regional identities. There's a growing recognition that names carry power and that the way we label places affects how we think about them. The irony is that Africa, this externally imposed name, has now become a source of pride and identity for millions of people. The African Union uses it officially. Pan-African movements embrace it. People across the diaspora claim it as their identity. A name that started as colonial imposition has been transformed into a tool of unity and resistance. What's the lesson here? Names matter. Who gets to do the naming matters even more. The story of how Africa got its name reveals how power operates through seemingly simple acts like making maps and choosing words. It shows how outside perspectives can become so dominant that they override local knowledge and identity. But it also shows how people can take imposed names and make them their own. Africa today means something completely different than it meant to those Roman administrators in Tunisia or those European cartographers in their studios. It's become a name that represents resilience, diversity, and shared struggle. So the next time someone asks who named African, you can tell them it wasn't Africans. It was Romans, then Europeans, then the whole world just went along with it. But you can also tell them that names don't have to stay the same forever, and that the people who live in places ultimately get to decide what those names mean. The real power isn't in who originally chose the name, but in who gets to define what it represents today.